In the vast expanse of the Texas plains, where the horizon stretches endlessly and the wind carries stories older than memory, there lived a man who believed himself incomplete. Born with only his right hand, he had spent 34 years hiding from a world that seemed designed for those with two. But sometimes, the very thing makes us broken is exactly what makes us whole. This is the story of how 11 young women from the Comanche Nation taught a cowboy that completion isn't about what you have, it's about what you give. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Daniel Crawford stood in the doorway of his workshop, the morning sun casting long shadows across the floor littered with wood shavings and abandoned projects. His right hand, calloused and strong from years of compensating, gripped a half-finished chair leg. Where his left arm ended just below the elbow, the empty sleeve of his work shirt hung loose, pinned back in a way that had become second nature. The workshop was his sanctuary, built with his own hands over the course of 3 summers. Every beam, every nail, every carefully measured joint bore the mark of a man who had learned to do everything differently. Tools hung on pegboards designed for one-handed operation. Workbenches sat at precisely the right height. Clamps and vices were positioned where he could reach them without thinking. But for all his adaptations, the morning light illuminated what he couldn't build away: the hesitation in his movements, the way he turned his body to hide his left side. When footsteps approached on the path outside, the careful choreography of a man who had spent his life trying to become invisible. Daniel had been born this way in the winter of 1855, during one of the harshest storms anyone in Millbrook County could remember. His mother, Ruth Crawford, had labored for 18 hours while snow piled against the windows of their small cabin. When he finally arrived, purple and fighting for breath, the midwife's first words weren't about his missing hand. She spoke of his fierce grip with the one he had, how his tiny fingers had immediately wrapped around her thumb with startling strength. But as he grew, the questions came. Children pointed and whispered. Adults stared and looked away. His father, William Crawford, a blacksmith with hands like anvils, had tried to teach him the trade. For 3 years, Daniel had stood beside the forge, watching his father shape iron with 2 powerful arms, learning to pump the bellows with his right hand while using his left arm to steady the leather handle. The day he turned 16, Daniel had attempted to forge his first horseshoe. He'd heated the iron to the perfect orange glow, positioned it on the anvil, and raised the hammer. But without a second hand to hold the tongs steady, the hot metal had twisted, sending sparks flying. The shoe had emerged crooked, useless. His father had said nothing, but Daniel had seen the disappointment in his eyes. That night, he'd made a decision that would shape the next 18 years of his life. He would never again put himself in a position where his difference defined him. He'd left Millbrook County the following spring, taking only his horse, a saddlebag of tools he'd modified himself, and a letter of credit his father had grudgingly provided. He'd drifted west, following railroad crews and cattle drives, picking up work where he could. He'd learned to shoe horses one-handed, developed a technique with rope that relied on leverage rather than grip, and discovered he could read the land, the way grass bent in the wind, the patterns of animal tracks, the subtle signs of weather change, better than most men with 2 good hands. But always, he'd moved on before anyone could get too close, before the questions came, before the sympathy or the awkward silences that followed when people noticed. 5 years ago, he'd stopped running. He'd found this patch of land in western Texas, where the Brazos River bent through cottonwood groves, and the nearest neighbor was a day's ride away. He'd built his cabin, his workshop, his life of careful solitude. He'd established a reputation as a craftsman who could repair anything: saddles, wagon wheels, furniture, and who asked no questions and expected none in return. People brought him work and left it on his porch. He completed it and left it there for pickup, payment tucked under a stone. Sometimes he'd see riders approaching and would retreat into the workshop until they left. It wasn't unfriendliness, exactly. It was preservation. The town of Cedar Ridge, 12 miles east, knew him as the hermit craftsman who could fix what others couldn't. They whispered stories about him. Some said he'd been a soldier who'd lost his hand in the war. Others claimed he'd been born to witches, cursed with incompleteness. Daniel had heard the stories on his rare trips to town for supplies. He'd learned to let people believe whatever they needed to believe. This morning, like every morning for the past 5 years, he'd risen before dawn, tended his small garden, fed his chickens, and saddled his horse Jasper for a ride across his land. It was a ritual that kept him grounded, this daily survey of his domain. The 160 acres weren't much by Texas standards, but they were his, every mesquite tree and prairie dog hole. He'd inherited his mother's eye for beauty. The cabin sat on a slight rise that caught the morning sun and the evening breeze. A creek ran along the southern boundary, lined with willow trees that his mother would have loved. He'd planted wildflowers around the cabin bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush, though he told himself it was practical, something to prevent erosion. But as he stood in his workshop doorway, watching the dust motes dance in the morning light, Daniel felt the familiar weight of incompleteness settling on his shoulders. Not the physical incompleteness. He'd long since learned to navigate the world with one hand. It was something deeper, a hollow space where connection should be. He'd taught himself to read by lamplight, devouring books ordered from back east. He could discuss philosophy, astronomy, and the poetry of Walt Whitman. He understood crop rotation, animal husbandry, the principles of engineering that allowed him to design his ingenious one-handed tools. But all of this knowledge lived in isolation, shared with no one, valuable only to himself. Sometimes, when the wind was right, he could hear voices from the Comanche encampments that moved seasonally through the territory. He'd glimpse their horses on distant ridges, see the smoke from their fires. But he'd never approached, never allowed curiosity to overcome caution. They were a people with their own completeness, their own wholeness. What could a broken man offer them? Daniel returned to his workbench and picked up the chair leg he'd been shaping. It was part of a dining set ordered by a family in Cedar Ridge, a table and 6 chairs for a house he'd never see, meals he'd never share. He ran his fingers along the smooth wood, checking for imperfections. The grain was perfect, the curve exactly as he'd envisioned. In many ways, this piece of furniture would be more complete than its maker. He'd developed a technique for chair making that compensated for his limitation. Instead of trying to hold pieces in place while joining them, he'd created an elaborate system of jigs and clamps that could secure multiple components simultaneously. The process took longer, but the results were often superior to what two-handed craftsmen produced. His chairs never wobbled, never loosened at the joints. They were built to last generations. As he worked, the familiar rhythm soothed him. The scrape of the plane against wood, the gentle shower of shavings, the gradual emergence of the perfect curve he could see in his mind. This was meditation, prayer, the closest thing to peace he knew. But today, the peace felt fragile. Perhaps it was the approaching summer, the way the morning air already carried hints of the scorching heat to come. Perhaps it was the dream he'd had the night before, a strange vision of hands reaching toward him, not in pity or curiosity, but in invitation. He'd woken with an odd sense of anticipation, as if something was approaching that would change everything. He shook his head, focusing on the wood. Dreams were for people who still believed in possibility. He'd learned long ago that the only reliable truth was the work itself, the solid reality of what he could accomplish with patience and skill. Chair leg was nearly finished when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong to his carefully ordered world. Hoofbeats, approaching fast. Not the measured pace of someone delivering work, but the urgent rhythm of flight. Daniel set down his plane and moved to the window. In the distance, a horse and rider crested the hill that marked the eastern boundary of his land. Even from this distance, he could see something was wrong. The horse was lathered, its gait uneven. The rider was slumped forward, barely maintaining their seat. His first instinct was to retreat deeper into the workshop, to wait until whatever trouble this represented passed by his land and became someone else's concern. He'd built his life around avoiding exactly this kind of complication. But as the horse stumbled and the rider nearly fell, Daniel felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the pull of another person's need. His mother had always said that compassion wasn't a choice, it was a calling. You either answered it or spent the rest of your life wondering what you might have become. He walked to the porch, shading his eyes against the morning sun. The rider was definitely in trouble now, listing dangerously to one side. The horse had slowed to a walk, its head hanging low with exhaustion. Daniel stood there for a long moment, feeling the weight of decision. Opening his door to trouble went against every instinct he'd cultivated. But watching another human being suffer went against something deeper, something his years of solitude hadn't managed to silence. He stepped off the porch and began walking toward the approaching horse and rider, his right hand hanging loose at his side, his left sleeve pinned back as always. Whatever was coming toward him would see him exactly as he was, incomplete, careful, but willing to help. As he drew closer, he could see that the rider was young, with long dark hair and clothes that belonged to no culture he immediately recognized. The horse was a painted mare, beautiful but clearly pushed beyond endurance. 20 yards away, the rider finally lost their battle with consciousness and began to slide sideways. Daniel broke into a run, reaching them just as they fell. He caught the slight figure with his right arm, immediately recognizing two things. This was a girl, probably no more than 18, and she was burning with fever. He looked up at the horse, which stood perfectly still now, sides heaving. The mare's eyes were intelligent, patient. She seemed to understand that her burden had been transferred to someone else, someone who would take responsibility. For the first time in 5 years, Daniel Crawford carried another human being across his threshold. And in that moment, though he didn't yet know it, his carefully constructed world of solitude began to crack open, making room for something he had never imagined possible. Daniel carried the unconscious girl into his cabin, her weight barely registering against his shoulder. She was small-boned, delicate, but there was something about the way she held herself even in unconsciousness that spoke of inner strength. Her clothes were unlike anything he'd seen in Cedar Ridge, a dress of soft leather decorated with intricate beadwork, moccasins that looked hand-stitched, and silver ornaments braided into her dark hair. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He laid her on his narrow bed, the only bed in the cabin, and immediately began assessing her condition. The fever was intense, radiating heat through the thin leather of her dress. Her breathing was shallow but steady. When he gently turned her head to check for injuries, he discovered a nasty gash along her left temple, partially hidden by her hair. The wound was several days old, showing signs of infection. Daniel had learned basic medical care out of necessity. Living alone meant being your own doctor, and he'd treated everything from infected cuts to snake bites over the years. But this was different. This girl needed more than his rough frontier medicine could provide. He heated water in his largest pot and gathered what supplies he had: clean cloth torn from an old shirt, a bottle of whiskey for cleaning wounds, and willow bark tea for the fever. As he worked, he found himself moving with an efficiency he hadn't experienced in years. When you live alone, tasks can stretch to fill available time. But with someone depending on him, every movement had purpose. The painted mare still stood, where he'd left her, reins dragging in the dust. Daniel approached her slowly, speaking in low tones. The horse watched him warily, but didn't bolt when he reached for the reins. She was beautiful white with brown patches that looked like they'd been painted by an artist's careful brush. Her tack was minimal but well made, designed for long distances rather than show. "Easy, girl," Daniel murmured, running his hand along her neck. "Let's get you some water and grain." He led the mare to his small corral and removed her tack with practiced one-handed movements. The horse immediately went to the water trough, drinking deeply but not desperately. Someone had trained her well. She knew to pace herself even when thirsty. Back in the cabin, the girl was stirring fitfully. Daniel knelt beside the bed and gently began cleaning the wound on her temple. The infection was worse than he'd initially thought. Red streaks extended down toward her jaw, and the edges of the cut were angry and swollen. She moaned softly as he worked, her head turning away from his touch. For the first time, Daniel heard her voice a musical quality, even in distress. Words in a language he didn't recognize but somehow understood the meaning of. She was asking for water. He helped her sit up enough to sip from a cup, supporting her with his right arm while she drank. Her eyes opened briefly, dark and confused, looking around the unfamiliar cabin before settling on his face. There was no fear in her gaze, which surprised him. Most people who woke up in a stranger's bed would show some alarm. Instead, she studied him with curious intensity, her eyes moving from his face to his pinned sleeve and back again. She whispered something in her own language, then closed her eyes and drifted back into fevered sleep. Over the next 3 days, Daniel maintained a constant vigil. He cleaned and dressed her wound twice daily, forcing willow bark tea and small amounts of broth into her when she was conscious enough to swallow. He learned the rhythm of her fever high during the day, breaking into sweats during the night, leaving her weak but lucid in the early morning hours. It was during one of these lucid moments, just before dawn on the 4th day, that she spoke her first English words to him. "You saved my life," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel was sitting in his chair beside the bed, whittling a piece of cedar by lamplight. He looked up, surprised by the clarity in her eyes. "You saved your own life," he replied. "You made it here. I just thought that helped a little." She turned her head to study him more carefully. "You live alone?" It wasn't a question. Daniel nodded. "Why?" The simple directness of the question caught him off guard. In the civilized world, people danced around personal topics, approached them sideways with small talk and careful courtesy. But this girl cut straight to the heart of things. "It's easier," he said finally. "Easier than what?" Daniel set down his whittling knife, then explaining. She was quiet for a long moment, processing this. Then she raised her right hand and placed it flat against her chest. "Ayana," she said. "My name is Ayana. Daniel." "Daniel," she repeated, testing the sound. "You are kind, Daniel. I'm just doing what anyone would do." "No," she said with certainty. "Most would not. Most would see my clothes, my skin, and turn away. They would think, this is not my problem." Daniel couldn't argue with that. He'd seen enough prejudice in his travels to know she was right. "What happened to you?" he asked. "How did you get hurt?" Ayana's expression darkened. "Traders, white men from the east. They came to our camp with goods to sell, blankets, tools, whiskey. But they were not honest traders. When our men were away hunting, they tried to take what was not offered." She touched the bandage on her temple gingerly. "I tried to protect the younger girls. One of the men struck me with a rifle stock. I fell and hit my head on a rock. The bleeding would not stop, and I became weak, confused. I thought I was going to die. But you didn't die. You rode for help. I rode without thinking. Storm Runner, my horse, she knew to find help. She has wisdom I did not always possess." Daniel glanced toward the window, where he could see the painted mare grazing in his corral. Storm Runner. That's a good name for her. She has carried me through many storms. This was not the worst. Something in her tone made Daniel look at her more closely. You've been on your own before. Since I was 14, my family ... She paused, choosing her words carefully. My family was lost to soldiers. I have lived with different bands of our people since then, never staying long. Enough to become a burden. That's a hard way to live. It is the way I know, until now. The conversation was interrupted by a fit of coughing that left Ayanna exhausted. Daniel helped her sip more willow bark tea, noting that her fever was breaking more completely each time. By evening, she was sitting up on her own, eating solid food for the first time since arriving. Over the following days, as Ayanna's strength returned, Daniel discovered that his carefully ordered world was adapting to accommodate another presence. She was observant, noticing how he'd modified everything for one-handed operation, without commenting on it directly. Instead, she found ways to help that didn't call attention to his limitations. When he was preparing meals, she would position ingredients within his reach. When he was working in his shop, she would hold pieces steady without being asked. Her assistance was so natural, so unassuming, that Daniel barely noticed it happening until he realized tasks were becoming easier. You are a craftsman, she observed one afternoon, watching him work on the dining set for Cedar Ridge. Of sorts. My grandfather was a craftsman. He made beautiful arrows, each one balanced perfectly. He said that creating something useful was a form of prayer. Daniel paused in his planning. I never thought of it that way. What do you think of it as? Keeping busy, I suppose. Staying useful. Ayanna shook her head. No, I have watched you work. You love the wood, the way it becomes. What you see in your mind. That is not just keeping busy. That is creation. She stood and walked to his tool wall, studying the carefully arranged implements. Each tool hung in its designated place, modified or positioned for one-handed use. You have made yourself complete, she said quietly. I've made myself functional. Is there a difference? Daniel set down his plane and looked at her. You tell me. Ayanna traced the air on one of his modified clamps, a device he'd engineered to hold multiple pieces of wood simultaneously. In my culture, she said, we believe that everyone is born with exactly what they need for their purpose. Not more. Not less. The challenge is discovering what that purpose is. And if you never discover it, then you spend your life feeling incomplete, even if you have everything others think you should want. Daniel felt something shift inside his chest, a recognition he wasn't ready to name. What do you think my purpose is? He asked, surprising himself with the question. Ayanna turned to face him, her dark eyes serious. I think you already know. You just have not admitted it to yourself yet. That evening, as they shared a meal of venison stew and cornbread, Ayanna told Daniel more about her life with the Comanche bands. She described a world that was disappearing, pressured by settlers and soldiers, treaties made and broken, a way of life being pushed steadily westward. My people are strong, she said, but strength alone is not enough anymore. We need allies, people who can bridge the gap between our world and yours. I'm not much of a bridge, Daniel said. I barely exist in my own world. Perhaps that is exactly what makes you valuable. You understand what it means to be apart, to be seen as different. Daniel stirred his stew thoughtfully. Why are you telling me this? Because I see something in you that you do not see in yourself. And because ... double quotes, she hesitated, then continued. Because when I was unconscious, feverish, I had dreams. In the dreams, there were hands reaching toward me. Not two hands, one hand. But it was enough. It was exactly what was needed. Dreams don't mean anything. In my culture, dreams are messages. They show us possibilities we might not otherwise see. Daniel looked across the table at this young woman who had crashed into his solitary life like a comet, bringing disruption and something that felt dangerously like hope. "Ayana," he said carefully, "when you're well enough to travel, where will you go?" She met his eyes steadily. "That depends. On what?" "On whether you believe you might have a purpose beyond hiding from the world." Outside, Stormrunner nickered softly in the corral, and the evening wind carried the scent of wildflowers and distant rain. Daniel felt the walls of his carefully constructed isolation beginning to thin, and for the first time in years, he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to repair them. As Ayana's strength fully returned, Daniel discovered that sharing his space with another person required adjustments he hadn't anticipated. Not physical adjustments, those came naturally as she learned the rhythm of his modifications. The deeper changes were in the silences between words, the gradual lowering of walls he'd built so carefully over the years. She had been with him for 2 weeks when she first asked to see his workshop properly. Daniel had been protective of that space, his sanctuary where every tool and technique bore the mark of his adaptation. But Ayana's curiosity was different from the morbid fascination he'd encountered before. She wanted to understand how he created, not how he compensated. "Show me how you make the joints so perfect," she said, running her fingers along the corner of a nearly completed chair. "I have watched through the window, but I want to understand the thinking behind it." Daniel picked up one of his modified clamps, a device that had taken him months to perfect. Most woodworkers rely on holding pieces steady with their hands while they work. "I had to find another way." He demonstrated how the clamp system worked, how multiple angles could be secured simultaneously, allowing him to work with precision that sometimes exceeded what 2 hands could achieve. "This is not a compromise," Ayana observed. "This is innovation. It's a necessity." "No," she said firmly. "Necessity would be finding a way to make something adequate. This is excellence through different thinking." She picked up a piece of walnut he'd been shaping for a table leg, testing its weight and balance. "In my culture, we have stories about the first maker, the spirit who created the world. Some say he had many hands to shape the mountains and valleys. But the oldest stories say he had only one hand, and that is why the world has such beautiful asymmetry. 2 hands would have made everything too perfect, too predictable." Daniel watched her examine his work with genuine appreciation, not the careful politeness he'd grown accustomed to. "You don't see it as broken. I see it as purposeful. Everything serves the vision you carry in your mind." Over the following days, Ayana began sharing skills of her own. She showed Daniel how to read weather patterns and cloud formations he'd never noticed, how to track different animals by subtle differences in their prints, and how to identify medicinal plants that grew wild on his land. "This is prairie sage," she said, kneeling beside a low bush near the creek. "Good for cleansing wounds, but also for clearing the mind when you smoke it in ceremony." "Ceremony?" "Rituals that connect us to something larger than ourselves." "Do you have ceremonies, Daniel?" He considered this. "I go to church sometimes when I'm in town, Christmas, Easter. That is a ceremony imposed from outside. I mean a ceremony that comes from within, that honors what is uniquely yours." Daniel had never thought of his daily routines, the morning survey of his land, the careful arrangement of his tools, the meditative rhythm of his craftwork as ceremony. But Ayana's words gave them new meaning. "When you work with wood," she continued, "you enter a different state of mind. I have watched you. You become completely present, completely focused. That is a form of prayer, whether you call it that or not." She taught him to identify edible plants he'd never noticed, showed him how to weave grass into cordage stronger than store-bought rope. In return, he shared the mechanical principles behind his inventions, the mathematical relationships that governed proportion and strength in his furniture. "You think like an engineer," she said one afternoon as he explained the stress distribution. "In a properly jointed chair. I think like someone who can't afford mistakes. No, it is more than that. You see patterns, relationships. You understand how forces work together to create stability. Their conversations ranged from practical skills to philosophy, from memories of childhood to observations about the changing world around them. Ayanna spoke of the pressure her people faced, the way their traditional territories were shrinking. The young people caught between two worlds. Some of our youth try to adopt white ways completely, she said. They cut their hair, wear your clothes, speak only English. But something dies in them when they do this. They become neither Comanche nor white, they become lost. And others? Others resist everything from your world, even things that could help our people survive. They hold so tightly to the old ways that they cannot adapt to new realities. Daniel understood this tension. He'd spent years rejecting connection to avoid rejection, but the isolation had become its own kind of prison. What's the answer? He asked. I think the answer is people who can live in both worlds without losing themselves in either. People who can translate between different ways of understanding. She looked at him meaningfully. People who know what it means to be different, but who have found strength in that difference. The third week brought visitors. Daniel was in his workshop when he heard horses approaching, not the urgent rhythm of flight that had announced Ayanna's arrival, but the measured pace of intentional travel. Through his window, he saw 3 Comanche riders cresting the hill. Daniel's chest tightened. He'd known this moment would come, but he wasn't prepared for the complexity of emotions it brought. Relief that Ayanna would be reunited with her people. Fear that his brief experience of companionship was ending. And something deeper, a sense that whatever was approaching would change everything. Ayanna emerged from the cabin, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun. When she recognized the riders, her face lit up with joy. But Daniel also noticed something else, a tension in her shoulders, a wariness that hadn't been there moments before. The lead rider was a young woman, perhaps 25, with intricate braids and silver ornaments that caught the light. Behind her rode 2 others, slightly younger, all moving with the fluid grace of people who'd grown up on horseback. They stopped 20 yards from the cabin, and the lead rider spoke in rapid Comanche. Ayanna responded, gesturing toward Daniel. Toward the cabin, explaining something with animated hand movements. Daniel stepped onto his porch, conscious of his pinned sleeve, of how he must appear to these strangers. But when the lead rider's eyes found him, he saw only curiosity, not judgment. My sister tells us you saved her life, the woman said in accented but clear English. I am Nayeli. These are my companions, Itzel and Xochitl. Daniel nodded, uncertain of the proper response. I did what anyone would do. Nayeli's expression suggested she disagreed with this assessment, but she didn't argue the point. Instead, she dismounted gracefully and approached the porch. Ayanna says you are a maker of beautiful things, she said. May we see? Daniel glanced at Ayanna, who nodded encouragingly. He led them into his workshop, where the dining set for Cedar Ridge was nearing completion. The 3 women examined his work with obvious appreciation, running their hands along the smooth joints, testing the stability of the chairs. This is excellent craftsmanship, Nayeli said. Better than what we see in the trading posts. You have created your own techniques, observed Itzel, studying his clamp system. Very clever. Xochitl, the youngest, seemed most interested in his tool modifications. She picked up a plane he'd adapted with an extended handle, testing its balance. You work differently, but not less, she said in halting English. The simple statement hit Daniel with unexpected force. All his life, he'd assumed that being different meant being diminished. But these women saw adaptation as innovation, limitation, as the mother of creativity. Ayanna tells us you live alone by choice, Nayeli said. This surprises us. Why? Because we can see you are meant to be a teacher. Your solutions to challenges, they could help many people. Daniel felt heat rise in his cheeks. I'm not a teacher. I just figure things out as I go. That is exactly what a teacher is, Nayeli smiled. Someone who figures things out and then shows others the way. The three women stayed for dinner, sharing news from various Comanche bands scattered across the territory. Daniel learned that Ayana's rescue had become a story told around campfires, but not the version he expected. They do not speak of her being saved by a white man, Nayeli explained. They speak of her finding a bridge person, someone who belongs to no single world but can move between them. A bridge person? In our prophecies, there are stories of people who will appear when our two worlds can no longer ignore each other. People who understand both separation and connection, who can translate between different ways of seeing. Daniel looked across the fire at Ayana, who was braiding cordage with quick, sure movements. Ayana mentioned something like this before. Ayana has the gift of seeing what others miss, Itzel said. When she was feverish, she spoke of hands reaching toward her in dreams. Not to take, but to offer. She said the hands belonged to someone who understood in completeness. But she also said, the hands were complete in themselves, Xochitl added. Powerful not despite being single, but because of it. That night, after the three women had made camp near the creek, Daniel sat on his porch with Ayana. The stars were brilliant in the clear sky, and the night sounds of the prairie surrounded them, crickets, the distant call of a night bird, the soft movement of wind through grass. They came to check on you, Daniel said. They came to meet you, Ayana corrected. Word has spread about the bridge person who lives alone but welcomes strangers. About the maker who creates beauty with one hand. I'm not a bridge person. I'm just someone who helped when help was needed. Ayana turned to study his profile in the starlight. Daniel, do you remember what you felt when you first saw me falling from Stormrunner? He thought back to that moment. I felt responsible, like I couldn't turn away. And when you carried me into your cabin, like I was bringing change into my life, like everything was about to be different. That is the feeling of stepping into your purpose, she said quietly. Not comfortable, not safe, but right. Daniel leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of implications he wasn't ready to examine. What if I'm not ready for a purpose? Then you practice until you are. The same way you practiced using tools until they became extensions of yourself. In the distance, a coyote howled, and Stormrunner nickered softly in response. The painted mare had settled into life at Daniel's homestead as naturally as Ayana had, as if both had found something they'd been searching for without knowing it. How long will they stay? Daniel asked. As long as we need them to, Ayana smiled. Did you think this was temporary, Daniel? Did you think I would heal and disappear, leaving you to your careful solitude? I assumed. You thought I would take what you offered and give nothing in return. But I am not taking from you, Daniel. I am showing you what you already possess. And tomorrow, if you are willing, my sisters will begin to show you as well. Daniel looked out at the three sleeping forms by the creek, then at the woman beside him who had turned his orderly world upside down with her presence, her questions, her absolute certainty that he was more than he believed himself to be. What exactly are they going to show me? That one hand can hold exactly what the world needs, Ayana said. And that being complete has nothing to do with having all the pieces others expect you to have. Daniel woke before dawn to find his world transformed. What had been his private domain for 5 years now bustled with quiet activity. Nayeli was tending a small fire by the creek, brewing tea from herbs she'd gathered. Itzel was examining his vegetable garden with the eye of someone who understood plants intimately. Xochitl had Stormrunner's reins in hand, preparing for what looked like a scouting expedition. As Daniel stepped onto his porch, Ayana emerged from the cabin carrying his coffee pot and 2 cups. They rise early, she said, settling beside him on the wooden steps he'd built to accommodate his modified height preferences. Are they leaving today? No, they are preparing. For what? Ayana sipped her coffee thoughtfully. Word travels fast among our people. The traitors who attacked our camp, they have been asking questions in the settlements. They know I escaped, and they fear what I might tell the authorities. Daniel's stomach tightened. What kind of questions? About a Comanche girl who might have sought shelter among the whites. They offer money for information and claim I stole from them. That's a lie. Truth and lies matter less than who people choose to believe. These men have learned that fear is profitable. They spread stories about dangerous Indians hiding among peaceful settlers, about the need for strong action to protect white families. Nayeli approached from the creek, carrying a steaming cup. Daniel Crawford, she said formally. We need to speak of serious matters. She settled cross-legged on the ground before the porch, her posture respectful but alert. The men who hurt Ayana, they are not simple traitors. They work for someone powerful, someone who benefits from conflict between our peoples. What do you mean? When treaties are broken, when violence erupts, who profits? It's a last joining. The group, those who sell weapons, those who claim Indian lands after we are driven away, those who supply the army with goods during campaigns against us. Daniel felt pieces of a larger picture sliding into place. They attacked your camp deliberately. They attacked specifically when our warriors were away hunting, Xochitl said, her young voice hard with anger. They knew we would be vulnerable. They wanted to provoke a response that would justify retaliation. And now they're trying to finish what they started, Nayeli continued. If they can prove that a dangerous Indian is being harbored by a white settler, they create the excuse they need for a broader action against our people. Daniel looked at Ayana, understanding flooding through him. That's why you asked if I had a purpose. This isn't about healing anymore. It never was only about healing, she replied. My recovery was the beginning, not the end. The beginning. Of what? Of proving that our peoples can coexist. That trust is possible. That the violent voices on both sides are not the only voices. Nayeli leaned forward. But this proof must come soon. Our scouts report that a military patrol is forming in the town called Cedar Ridge. They say it is to investigate reports of hostile Indians in the area. Daniel's blood chilled. Cedar Ridge was 12 miles away, close enough for men to reach. His homestead in a few hours of hard riding. How much time do we have? Perhaps 2 days, perhaps less. It depends on how quickly the traitors can convince the authorities to act. Then you should leave, all of you. I'll tell anyone who asks that I never saw any Indians. No, Ayana said firmly. Running confirms their accusations. It gives them the excuse they seek. Staying could get us all killed. Staying gives us the chance to tell a different story, Nayeli said. The story of a white man who helped a wounded girl without asking her race or religion. The story of trust freely given and honor upheld. Itzel stood and walked to Daniel's workshop door, peering inside at his carefully arranged tools. You have built something here that works through precision, through understanding how forces balance against each other. This situation requires the same thinking. I don't understand. You do not defeat aggression with greater aggression, Xochitl explained. You defeat it by removing its foundation. These men rely on fear and misunderstanding. We remove their power by demonstrating something different. Daniel rubbed his face with his hand, feeling the weight of decision settling on his shoulders. Everything in him wanted to protect these women by sending them away. But he was beginning to understand that protection and avoidance were not the same thing. What exactly are you proposing? We stay, Ayana said. When the soldiers come, they find exactly what we tell them they will find, a man sharing his home with people who need help. No violence, no theft, no threat, just neighbors. And if they don't see it that way, then we trust that truth is stronger than lies, Nayeli replied. But we also prepare for the possibility that it is not. The next few hours transformed Daniel's quiet homestead into something resembling a war council. The women spread a blanket on the ground and began drawing maps in the dirt with sticks, marking approaches to the property, defensive positions, and escape routes. Daniel watched this tactical planning with growing amazement. These women weren't warriors in the traditional sense, but they understood strategy with the clarity of people whose survival had always depended on quick thinking and careful preparation. "The creek provides good cover along the southern boundary," Itzel observed, sketching lines in the dust. "But it also limits our mobility if we need to retreat. The workshop has only one entrance," Xochitl added. "Safe for defense, but dangerous if surrounded." "The cabin sits on high ground with good sight lines," Nayeli said. "Whoever approaches will be visible long before they arrive." Daniel found himself drawn into the planning despite his reservations. His knowledge of the land, combined with their tactical expertise, created a surprisingly comprehensive strategy. "But our best defense," Ayanna said, "is not appearing to need defense at all. We must seem like what we are, people living peacefully together." "That might be harder than it sounds," Daniel warned. "Some folks in Cedar Ridge already think I'm peculiar. Having Comanche guests won't help my reputation." "Your reputation is not built on conformity," Nayeli observed. "It is built on skill and reliability. People may whisper about your strangeness, but they respect your work." That afternoon, Daniel rode to Cedar Ridge for supplies, leaving the women to continue their preparations. He needed to gauge the mood in town, to understand what kind of pressure was building. The general store buzzed with conversation that died when he entered. Miss Whitman, the store clerk, greeted him with unusual curtness. Several men he recognized from previous visits avoided meeting his eyes. At the counter, he overheard fragments of conversation between two ranchers. Double quotes. "Seen smoke from fires that ain't got no business being there. Tracks where tracks shouldn't be. Time somebody did something before it gets out of hand. As Daniel paid for his goods, extra flour, coffee, medical supplies that might be needed, Miss Whitman leaned across the counter. "Daniel," she said quietly, "there's been talk about strangers on your land, about you harboring people you shouldn't be harboring." "I harbor whoever needs help," he replied evenly. "That's a dangerous position these days. Colonel Morrison's been asking questions about every homestead between here and the Brazos. He's particularly interested in reports of unusual activity." Daniel's chest tightened. Colonel Morrison commanded the garrison at Fort Belknap, 30 miles northeast. If military attention was focusing on his area, the situation was more serious than he'd realized. "What kind of unusual activity?" "The kind that gets good people caught in bad situations," Miss Whitman said meaningfully. "The kind that might require folks to choose sides when they'd rather stay neutral." As Daniel loaded his supplies into his wagon, he noticed several men gathered outside the saloon, their conversation stopping when they saw him. One of them, a trader named Briggs who'd always given Daniel a wide berth because of his arm, stepped forward. "Crawford," Briggs called. "Out. Heard you've been entertaining visitors lately." "I entertain whoever visits," Daniel replied, not breaking stride. "Some visitors are more welcome than others in a civilized community." Daniel stopped and turned to face the group. 6 men, all armed, all watching him with hostile curiosity. This was the confrontation he'd spent 5 years avoiding, but running from it now would confirm their suspicions. "All visitors are welcome at my homestead," he said clearly. "Anyone who needs help gets help. Anyone who comes in peace leaves in peace. And anyone who comes with hostile intent?" Briggs pressed. "Get exactly what they bring with them." The men exchanged glances. Daniel could see them weighing his words, trying to determine if this quiet, one-handed man represented a threat or an opportunity. "Word is you've got Indian visitors," another man said. "That's a dangerous game in current times." "I've got people," Who need help, Daniel corrected. Their heritage is their own business. Their heritage becomes everyone's business when it threatens the safety of honest settlers. Briggs snapped. Daniel climbed onto his wagon seat, gathering the reins in his hand. The only threat to honest settlers is dishonest men who profit from fear and conflict. He drove away before anyone could respond, but he could feel their eyes following him out of town. The confrontation had been inevitable, and now it was done. Whatever came next would be faced with clarity rather than uncertainty. The ride home gave him time to think. For 5 years, he'd avoided taking positions on anything controversial. He'd kept his head down, minded his own business, and tried to exist without creating ripples. But neutrality was no longer an option. The forces moving through his world demanded that he choose a side. He chose the side of the women who'd seen strength where others saw limitation, who'd offered partnership where others offered pity, who'd trusted him with their safety despite having every reason to be suspicious of white men. When he reached his homestead, he found 8 more horses in his corral. The women had been busy in his absence. Reinforcements? He asked Ayanna as she helped him unload the wagon. Sisters, she corrected. The word has spread. Others want to see the bridge for themselves. Daniel looked toward the creek, where a larger camp was taking shape. More cooking fires, more sleeping areas, the quiet bustle of an organized community. Settling in for what might be a siege. How many? 11 of us now, including me. The number from the old stories, the number required to complete the circle. What circle? Ayanna smiled, but her eyes were serious. The circle of witnesses, Daniel. When something important happens, it must be witnessed properly, or people will not believe it really occurred. That evening, as shadows lengthened across the prairie, Daniel found himself the center of attention for 11 remarkable women. They ranged in age from 18 to perhaps 30, each bringing different skills and perspectives. Some spoke English fluently, others communicated through gestures and smiles. But all of them watched him with the same expression he'd first seen in Ayanna's eyes, not pity or curiosity, but recognition. Around the fire, they shared stories of their lives, their hopes for their people's future, their understanding of the changes sweeping across their world. Daniel listened, gradually realizing that each woman represented a different aspect of Comanche society: healers, storytellers, craftspeople, leaders in training. Tomorrow, Naeli said as the fire burned. Lo, they will come. The soldiers, the traitors, the men who profit from division. They will expect to find what they always find: an excuse for more violence, more mistrust. Instead, Ayanna added, they will find something they cannot easily categorize or dismiss. They will find proof that their assumptions are wrong. Daniel looked around the circle of faces illuminated by firelight. 11 women who had chosen to stake their safety on the belief that he could represent something better than the hatred and fear they'd experienced from other white men. What if I disappoint? You? He asked quietly. You cannot disappoint us, said a young woman named Istas. You can only be who you are. That is all we ask. And who do you think I am? You are the man who opened his door, Ayanna replied. Everything else follows from that choice. As the women settled into their sleeping arrangements by the creek, Daniel sat alone on his porch, looking out at the most extraordinary sight his homestead ever hosted. Tomorrow would bring a test that none of them could avoid. But tonight, for the first time in his adult life, he felt truly accompanied, not just by the presence of others, but by their absolute confidence in his worth. The stars wheeled overhead. And somewhere in the distance, a night bird called across the prairie, its voice carrying both warning and welcome into the darkness. Dawn broke, gray and heavy, with storm clouds massing on the horizon like an advancing army. Daniel stood at his window, coffee cup warming his palm, watching the 11 women move through their morning routines with the fluid efficiency of people accustomed to uncertainty. There was no panic in their movements, no hurried preparation, just The quiet competence of individuals who had faced danger before and understood that survival often depended on appearing unthreatened. Ayanna approached the cabin carrying a bundle wrapped in soft deerskin. "Today you will need this," she said, unwrapping a shirt unlike any Daniel had ever seen. The leather was supple as cloth, dyed a deep earth brown and decorated with intricate beadwork that seemed to shift and flow in the morning light. "I can't wear this," Daniel protested. "It's too fine, too. It was made for you," Ayanna interrupted. "All of us worked on it over these past days." Each woman contributed something: beads, stitching, the traditional patterns that tell the story of strength found in difference. Daniel held the shirt up, marveling at the craftsmanship. The left sleeve had been modified, shortened, and finished with elegant beadwork that transformed what might have been seen as a flaw into an intentional design element. Why? Because when they come today, they must see you as we see you, not as a broken white man hiding in the wilderness, but as someone who has found wholeness through accepting his unique path. As Daniel changed into the shirt, he felt a transformation that went beyond clothing. The leather fit perfectly, accommodating his body's asymmetry without calling attention to it. The beadwork caught the light with every movement, creating patterns that suggested strength and purpose. When he emerged from the cabin, the women's faces showed quiet satisfaction. Nayeli nodded approvingly. "Now you look like who you truly are." "And who is that?" "A bridge," said Istas, the youngest of the group. "Someone who can stand between two worlds without belonging completely to either." The morning air carried the sound of approaching horses long before the riders appeared. Daniel counted at least 20 men, more than he'd expected. At their head rode Colonel Morrison, a tall man with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. Beside him was the trader Briggs, and behind them a mix of soldiers and civilians that suggested this was more than a routine patrol. "They came in force," observed Malinali, a healer who'd arrived only yesterday. "Fear always travels in numbers." Ayanna replied. Daniel walked out to meet them, the 11 women following at a respectful distance. As the riders approached, he could see Morrison sizing up the situation, the peaceful camp by the creek, the women's calm demeanor, Daniel himself standing unafraid in his distinctive shirt. The colonel raised his hand, bringing his men to a halt 20 yards from the cabin. For a long moment, no one spoke. Daniel could feel the weight of expectations, the collision of different worldviews trying to find some common ground. "Mr. Crawford," Morrison said finally, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "I'm Colonel Morrison, commanding officer at Fort Belknap. We've received reports of suspicious activity on your property." "What kind of suspicious activity?" Daniel asked evenly. "Harboring hostile Indians, providing aid and comfort to enemies of white settlers." Daniel felt anger rising in his chest, but Ayanna's earlier words echoed in his mind. Anger clouds judgment, and today judgment must be crystal clear. "I see no enemies here, Colonel. I see women who needed help and chose to stay as guests." Briggs urged his horse forward. "Those are Comanche warriors, Crawford. Dangerous savages who—" "Those are Comanche women," Daniel corrected, his voice cutting through Briggs' bluster. "Healers, craftspeople, teachers. Not one of them carries a weapon." Morrison's eyes swept over the group by the creek, taking in details that clearly didn't match his expectations. The women stood calmly, their posture neither defiant nor submissive. Their clothes were clean and well-maintained, their faces serene. This wasn't the scene of desperate fugitives hiding from justice. "Mr. Crawford," Morrison said carefully, "perhaps you could explain how you came to be hosting this gathering." Daniel told the story simply, without embellishment. Ayanna's arrival, her injuries, the natural development of trust that had followed. He spoke of skills shared, work accomplished together, the gradual revelation that cooperation was not only possible but beneficial. "And you expect me to believe," Briggs interrupted, that 11 Comanche squaws just happened to find their way to your isolated homestead out of the goodness of their hearts? I expect you to believe what your eyes tell you, Daniel replied. Do these women look like raiders? Do you see evidence of theft, of violence, of any threat to white settlers? One of Morrison's lieutenants leaned close to whisper something. The colonel nodded, then dismounted. Mr. Crawford, I'd like to speak with you privately. They walked toward the workshop, out of earshot of both groups. Morrison examined Daniel's setup with professional interest, noting the modified tools, the precision of the work in progress. You're not what I expected, Morrison said. What did you expect? A simple man led astray by feminine wiles and savage cunning. Instead, I find someone who's clearly thought this through. Daniel waited, sensing that Morrison was working towards something important. The thing is, Crawford, this situation has political implications beyond what you might realize. There are forces in Washington pushing for a more aggressive policy toward all Indian tribes. They need examples of white settlers being threatened, evidence that coexistence is impossible. And you need to provide those examples? Morrison's jaw tightened. I need to maintain peace in my territory while satisfying superiors who may not understand the complexities of the situation. Daniel looked back toward the two groups watching their conversation. What are you asking me to do? Colonel? I'm asking you to help me find a solution that satisfies everyone. These women can't stay here indefinitely. Eventually, their presence will provoke the kind of incident that benefits no one. What do you suggest? Morrison was quiet for a long moment, staring at the chair Daniel had been crafting. This is excellent work. Better than anything I've seen in the territory. Thank you. Where did you learn these techniques? I developed them myself. Had to given my circumstances. Morrison looked at Daniel's modified tools, his one-handed adaptations, the evidence of innovation born from necessity. You know, the Army needs skilled craftsmen. Men who can solve problems others can't, who can create solutions where none existed before. Daniel felt pieces clicking together. You're offering me a job. I'm offering you a way to be useful to your country while protecting people you care about. A position at Fort Belknap, creating furniture and equipment for the garrison. Official recognition of your skills, regular pay, and... Morrison paused significantly. Protection for anyone under your employment. Employment? These women have skills too, don't they? Healing, languages, knowledge of local terrain and resources. The Army could use cultural advisors, translators, people who understand how to navigate between worlds. Daniel stared at Morrison, realizing the colonel was far more sophisticated than his initial approach had suggested. You're proposing to solve the political problem by making us part of the solution. I'm proposing to recognize values where others see only threats. But it would require significant changes. You'd have to leave this homestead, relocate to the fort area. The women would need to accept oversight, regular reporting, behavior that wouldn't provide ammunition for your enemies. They walked back toward the waiting groups, Daniel's mind racing. Morrison's proposal was clever. It removed the immediate threat while providing legitimate cover for the relationships he'd built. But it also meant abandoning the independence he'd fought so hard to maintain. As they rejoined the others, Briggs was clearly agitated. Colonel, with respect, we didn't ride out here to negotiate with Indian sympathizers. We came to deal with a security threat. The situation is more complex than initially reported, Mr. Briggs, Morrison replied coolly. I see no evidence of hostile activity. Those are Comanche warriors. Those are Comanche women engaging in traditional crafts and peaceful activities. Unless you have evidence of actual crimes, I'm not prepared to take action against civilians. Briggs' face reddened. This is exactly the kind of soft thinking that's going to get honest settlers killed. And your kind of hasty judgment is exactly what starts wars that benefit no one except those who profit from conflict. Morrison shot back, The exchange confirmed Daniel's growing understanding that Morrison was caught between competing pressures: political demands for aggressive action and professional judgment that recognized the value of peace. Ayanna stepped forward, her movement fluid and unthreatening. "Colonel Morrison, may I speak?" Morrison nodded, curious. "My sisters and I understand the difficult position you face. We know there are those who would use our presence here as an excuse for actions that would harm both our peoples. We do not wish to be the cause of such harm. What are you proposing?" "We propose to remove the excuse by changing the story. Instead of hiding, we offer to serve. Our people have knowledge that could benefit the Army: tracking, languages, healing practices, understanding of terrain and weather patterns. We offer to share this knowledge in the service of peace." Morrison's eyebrows rose. These were not the words of desperate fugitives, but of people thinking strategically about their situation. And in return, protection for those who choose cooperation over conflict. Recognition that our peoples can work together when both sides act with honor. Briggs snorted. "You can't trust savage promises, Colonel." Nayeli spoke for the first time. "What promises have we broken, traitor? What trust have we violated? We came here injured and afraid and found healing and welcome. We have taken nothing, harmed no one, threatened no property. Can you say the same?" The question hung in the air, and Daniel could see its effect on Morrison's men. Whatever they'd expected to find, it wasn't this articulate group of women making reasonable proposals for mutual benefit. Morrison looked at Daniel. "What's your position on this proposal, Mr. Crawford?" Daniel felt the weight of the decision. Everything he'd built over 5 years of solitude was at stake. But as he looked at the 11 women who'd transformed his understanding of what was possible, he realized that some foundations were worth abandoning for the chance to build something better. "I think cooperation serves everyone's interests better than conflict," he said. "If you're serious about the position at Fort Belknap, I'm willing to discuss terms. And if I'm serious about positions for qualified cultural advisors," Daniel looked at Ayanna, who nodded almost imperceptibly, "then we have something to discuss." Morrison smiled for the first time since arriving. "Mr. Briggs, I believe this. Matter is resolved. No threats identified, no hostile activity discovered. I'll be reporting that civilian cooperation in this area is exemplary." Briggs' face went purple. "This is a mistake, Colonel. Mark my words. This kind of soft treatment is going to—" "Mr. Briggs," Morrison interrupted, his voice carrying a clear warning, "I suggest you focus on your trading business and leave military matters to military personnel." As the riders prepared to leave, Morrison lingered for a private word with Daniel. "This isn't over, you understand. There will be opposition, political pressure, and attempts to undermine what we're trying to build. I understand." "Good, because what you've accomplished here, bringing together people who are supposed to be enemies, creating trust where there was suspicion, that's rare. It's worth protecting." After the soldiers departed, Daniel found himself surrounded by 11 women whose faces showed a mixture of relief and anticipation. They had passed the first test, but greater challenges lay ahead. "So," Ayanna said, settling beside him on the porch steps, "are you ready to leave your sanctuary and enter the larger world?" Daniel looked out at the land he'd called home for 5 years, then at the women who'd shown him that home could be portable, that completeness could be found in connection rather than isolation. "I think I've been ready for longer than I realized," he said. "I just needed the right company to help me see it." As storm clouds gathered overhead, the first drops of rain began to fall, washing the dust of confrontation from the air and preparing the ground for whatever would grow next. The rain that had threatened all morning finally arrived in earnest. As Daniel and the 11 women gathered in his workshop to plan their departure from the homestead, water drummed against the roof with increasing intensity, creating a cocoon of sound that made their conversation feel both intimate and urgent. Morrison's eyes swept over the group by the creek, taking in details that clearly didn't match his expectations. The women stood calmly, their posture neither defiant nor submissive. Their clothes were clean and well-maintained, their faces serene. This wasn't the scene of desperate fugitives hiding from justice. "Mr. Crawford," Morrison said carefully, "perhaps you could explain how you came to be hosting this gathering." Daniel told the story simply, without embellishment. Ayana's arrival, her injuries, the natural development of trust that had followed. He spoke of skills shared, work accomplished together, the gradual revelation that cooperation was not only possible but beneficial. "And you expect me to believe," Briggs interrupted, "that 11 Comanche squaws just happened to find their way to your isolated homestead out of the goodness of their hearts?" "I expect you to believe what your eyes tell you," Daniel replied. "Do these women look like raiders? Do you see evidence of theft, of violence, of any threat to white settlers?" One of Morrison's lieutenants leaned close to whisper something. The colonel nodded, then dismounted. "Mr. Crawford, I'd like to speak with you privately." They walked toward the workshop, out of earshot of both groups. Morrison examined Daniel's setup with professional interest, noting the modified tools, the precision of the work in progress. "You're not what I expected," Morrison said. "What did you expect?" "A simple man led astray by feminine wiles and savage cunning. Instead, I find someone who's clearly thought this through." Daniel waited, sensing that Morrison was working towards something important. "The thing is, Crawford, this situation has political implications beyond what you might realize. There are forces in Washington pushing for a more aggressive policy toward all Indian tribes. They need examples of white settlers being threatened, evidence that coexistence is impossible. And you need to provide those examples." Morrison's jaw tightened. "I need to maintain peace in my territory while satisfying superiors who may not understand the complexities of the situation." Daniel looked back toward the two groups watching their conversation. "What are you asking me to do?" "Colonel, I'm asking you to help me find a solution that satisfies everyone. These women can't stay here indefinitely. Eventually, their presence will provoke the kind of incident that benefits no one. What do you suggest?" Morrison was quiet for a long moment, staring at the chair Daniel had been crafting. "This is excellent work. Better than anything I've seen in the territory." "Thank you. Where did you learn these techniques?" "I developed them myself. Had to given my circumstances." Morrison looked at Daniel's modified tools, his one-handed adaptations, the evidence of innovation born from necessity. "You know, the Army needs skilled craftsmen. Men who can solve problems others can't, who can create solutions where none existed before." Daniel felt pieces clicking together. "You're offering me a job. I'm offering you a way to be useful to your country while protecting people you care about. A position at Fort Belknap, creating furniture and equipment for the garrison. Official recognition of your skills, regular pay, and—" Morrison paused significantly. "Protection for anyone under your employment." "Employment? These women have skills too, don't they? Healing, languages, knowledge of local terrain and resources? The Army could use cultural advisors, translators, people who understand how to navigate between worlds." Daniel stared at Morrison, realizing the colonel was far more sophisticated than his initial approach had suggested. "You're proposing to solve the political problem by making us part of the solution. I'm proposing to recognize values where others see only threats. But it would require significant changes. You'd have to leave this homestead, relocate to the fort area. The women would need to accept oversight, regular reporting, behavior that wouldn't provide ammunition for your enemies." They walked back toward the waiting groups, Daniel's mind racing. Morrison's proposal was clever. It removed the immediate threat while providing legitimate cover for the relationships he'd built. But it also meant abandoning the independence he'd fought so hard to maintain. As they rejoined the others, Briggs was clearly agitated. "Colonel, with respect, we didn't ride out here to negotiate with Indian sympathizers. We came to deal with a security threat." "The situation is more complex than initially reported, Mr. Briggs," Morrison replied coolly. "I see no evidence of hostile activity. Those are Comanche warriors. Those are Comanche women engaging in traditional crafts and peaceful activities. Unless you have evidence of actual crimes, I'm not prepared to take action against civilians." Briggs' face reddened. "This is exactly the kind of soft thinking that's going to get honest settlers killed. And your kind of hasty judgment is exactly what starts wars that benefit no one except those who profit from conflict." Morrison shot back. The exchange confirmed Daniel's growing understanding that Morrison was caught between competing pressures: political demands for aggressive action and professional judgment that recognized the value of peace. Ayanna stepped forward, her movement fluid and unthreatening. "Colonel Morrison, may I speak?" Morrison nodded, curious. "My sisters and I understand the difficult position you face. We know there are those who would use our presence here as an excuse for actions that would harm both our peoples. We do not wish to be the cause of such harm. What are you proposing?" "We propose to remove the excuse by changing the story. Instead of hiding, we offer to serve. Our people have knowledge that could benefit the Army: tracking, languages, healing practices, understanding of terrain and weather patterns. We offer to share this knowledge in the service of peace." Morrison's eyebrows rose. These were not the words of desperate fugitives, but of people thinking strategically about their situation. And in return, protection for those who choose cooperation over conflict. Recognition that our peoples can work together when both sides act with honor. Briggs snorted. "You can't trust savage promises, Colonel." Nayeli spoke for the first time. "What promises have we broken, traitor? What trust have we violated? We came here injured and afraid and found healing and welcome. We have taken nothing, harmed no one, threatened no property. Can you say the same?" The question hung in the air, and Daniel could see its effect on Morrison's men. Whatever they'd expected to find, it wasn't this articulate group of women making reasonable proposals for mutual benefit. Morrison looked at Daniel. "What's your position on this proposal, Mr. Crawford?" Daniel felt the weight of the decision. Everything he'd built over 5 years of solitude was at stake. But as he looked at the 11 women who'd transformed his understanding of what was possible, he realized that some foundations were worth abandoning for the chance to build something better. "I think cooperation serves everyone's interests better than conflict," he said. "If you're serious about the position at Fort Belknap, I'm willing to discuss terms. And if I'm serious about positions for qualified cultural advisors," Daniel looked at Ayanna, who nodded almost imperceptibly, "then we have something to discuss." Morrison smiled for the first time since arriving. "Mr. Briggs, I believe this. Matter is resolved. No threats identified, no hostile activity discovered. I'll be reporting that civilian cooperation in this area is exemplary." Briggs' face went purple. "This is a mistake, Colonel. Mark my words. This kind of soft treatment is going to—" "Mr. Briggs," Morrison interrupted, his voice carrying a clear warning, "I suggest you focus on your trading business and leave military matters to military personnel." As the riders prepared to leave, Morrison lingered for a private word with Daniel. "This isn't over, you understand. There will be opposition, political pressure, and attempts to undermine what we're trying to build. I understand." "Good, because what you've accomplished here, bringing together people who are supposed to be enemies, creating trust where there was suspicion, that's rare. It's worth protecting." After the soldiers departed, Daniel found himself surrounded by 11 women whose faces showed a mixture of relief and anticipation. They had passed the first test, but greater challenges lay ahead. "So," Ayanna said, settling beside him on the porch steps, "are you ready to leave your sanctuary and enter the larger world?" Daniel looked out at the land he'd called home for 5 years, then at the women who'd shown him that home could be portable, that completeness could be found in connection rather than isolation. "I think I've been ready for longer than I realized," he said. "I just needed the right company to help me see it." As storm clouds gathered overhead, the first drops of rain began to fall, washing the dust of confrontation from the air and preparing the ground for whatever would grow next. The rain that had threatened all morning finally arrived in earnest. As Daniel and the 11 women gathered in his workshop to plan their departure from the homestead, water drummed against the roof with increasing intensity, creating a cocoon of sound that made their conversation feel both intimate and urgent. "Fort Belknap is not like this place," Nayeli said, studying the map Morrison had left behind. "There will be rules, schedules, people watching everything we do. There will also be protection," Malinali added pragmatically, "and the chance to influence how our peoples are seen by those in power." Daniel spread his own rough sketches across his workbench designs for the workshop space Morrison had promised him at the fort. "The Colonel seems genuine about creating positions for all of you, but we need to understand what we're walking into." Over the past week, since Morrison's visit, a steady stream of messages had passed between Daniel's homestead and Fort Belknap. The Colonel was moving quickly to formalize their arrangement before political opposition could organize against it. Daniel would serve as civilian master craftsman, responsible for all furniture and specialized equipment needs. The women would hold various advisory positions: cultural liaison, language instruction, medical consultation, territory mapping. But beneath the official titles lay a more complex reality. They were becoming symbols, proof that cooperation between whites and Comanche was possible. Everything they did would be scrutinized by supporters and enemies alike. "I've been thinking about the trading post incident," Daniel said, setting down his pencil. "About the men who attacked your camp, Ayana. They're still out there, still spreading poison." "Briggs and his associates," Itzel nodded grimly. "They will not give up easily. Too much money depends on maintaining hostility between our peoples. Which is why our success matters so much," Ayana said. "Every day we work together without conflict. Every problem we solve through cooperation instead of violence. We prove their narrative false." Daniel picked up a piece of cedar he'd been shaping, running his thumb along its smooth curve. The wood had been destined to become part of a chair for the dining set he'd never finished, the order from Cedar Ridge that now seemed like a relic from another life. "I'll miss this place," he admitted. 5 years I spent building something that was completely mine. And now you're building something that belongs to all of us," Xochitl said gently. "That is not loss, Daniel. That is growth." Through the workshop window, Daniel could see Storm Runner standing patiently in the rain, her painted coat dark with moisture. The Mare had become a bridge herself, as comfortable with his presence as with Ayana's, adapting to new routines while maintaining her essential spirit. "There's something I need to tell you," Daniel said, setting down the wood, "about what really undertaking." The women waited, recognizing the gravity in his tone. "Morrison let slip something during our negotiations. This arrangement, it's not just about solving a local problem. There are people in Washington watching how it develops. If we succeed, it could become a model for other regions. If we fail, it becomes evidence that coexistence is impossible, Nayeli. Finished. That peaceful solution doesn't work, exactly. We're not just choosing our own futures. We're potentially influencing policy toward all tribes across the territory." The weight of this responsibility settled over them like the storm clouds outside. But rather than crushing their spirits, it seemed to strengthen their resolve. "Then we cannot fail," Ista said simply. "Failure is always possible," Malinali corrected. "But we can ensure that if we fail, it is through honest effort rather than fear or misunderstanding." That afternoon, as the rain continued, Daniel began. The process of closing down his workshop. Each tool had to be carefully packed, each project either completed or prepared for transport. The women helped with quiet efficiency, understanding that this dismantling represented both ending and beginning. Ayanna found him in the cabin as evening approached, sitting at his small table with a stack of letters. What are those? Communications. From Morrison. Details about our new positions, housing arrangements, the schedule for our arrival. Daniel held up one letter. And this, a formal request from the War Department for a comprehensive report on successful integration protocols. They want to study us, Ayanna. Good, let them study. Let them see that your completeness comes not from having everything others expect, but from using what you have in service of something larger than yourself. Daniel laughed, but there was no humor in it. You have remarkable faith in someone you've known for barely a month. I have faith in what I've witnessed. When you found me bleeding in your yard, you didn't calculate the cost of helping. You didn't weigh the political implications. You saw the need and responded. That is who you are, Daniel Crawford. And when the pressure mounts at the fort, when people are watching our every interaction, looking for signs of failure or impropriety, when Briggs and his allies start spreading stories about the one-handed fool who thinks he can tame savage Indians. Ayanna sat across from him, her dark eyes steady. Then we remember that their words have power only if we give them power. And we remember that truth, lived honestly, is stronger than lies told loudly. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching horses cut through the rain. Daniel tensed, but Ayanna smiled. Those are not enemy hoofbeats, she was right. The riders who emerged from the storm were Comanche 3 men Daniel had never seen before, led by a figure whose presence commanded immediate attention, tall and broad-shouldered, with gray streaking his black hair and scars that spoke of many battles. He carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Ayanna's father? Daniel asked. No, someone more important. That is Chief Nokoni, leader of the southern bands. He has come to see for himself what we have built here. The chief and his companions dismounted without ceremony, tending to their horses with the practical efficiency of men for whom travel was a way of life. When they approached the cabin, Daniel stood to meet them, conscious of the beaded shirt that marked him as something other than a typical white settler. Chief. Nokoni's eyes took in everything, the peaceful camp by the creek, the women working around their fires despite the rain, Daniel himself standing unafraid in the doorway. When he spoke, his English was accented but clear. You are the bridge man I have heard stories about. I'm Daniel Crawford. I try to help where help is needed. And these women, they choose to be here. They choose freely. They stay freely. They will leave freely when they decide it is time. Nokoni's gaze moved to Daniel's left side, noting the modified shirt. The way Daniel naturally compensated for his missing hand. You work with wood, I am told. Yes. Show me. Despite the rain, Daniel led the chief to his workshop. Inside, by lamplight, he demonstrated some of his techniques, the clamp systems that allowed him to work alone, the modified tools that turned limitation into innovation. Nokoni examined the chair leg Daniel had been carving, testing its balance and smoothness. This is good work. Better than what we see from traders. Different circumstances require different approaches. Yes, different, but not lesser. The chief set down the wood and turned to face Daniel directly. My people have suffered much from white promises. Treaties broken, land stolen, families scattered. It has made us suspicious of all white men. Daniel waited, sensing this was leading somewhere important. But Ayanna and her sisters speak of something different here. They speak of a man who asks nothing but gives much, who sees strength where others see weakness, who builds bridges instead of walls. I've learned more from them than I've taught. That is what makes you worthy of trust. A man who learns is dangerous to those who profit from ignorance. Nokoni walked to the window, looking out at the rain-soaked landscape. The world is changing, Crawford. The old ways of fighting and hiding will not preserve my people. We need new ways, paths that lead to survival without surrender. What are you asking? I am asking if you understand the weight of what you carry. 11 of our finest young women have chosen to stake their futures on your character. If you succeed in this endeavor at the fort, you prove that cooperation is possible. If you fail... If I fail, I damage more than just my own life. Yes, but I do not think you will fail. Nokoni turned back to Daniel. You know what it means to be incomplete in the eyes of others. You know how to find strength in difference. That knowledge will serve you well in the challenges ahead. That evening, despite the storm, Chief Nokoni requested a formal gathering. Around a large fire in Daniel's cabin, with rain beating against the windows, the chief spoke to the assembled women about the significance of their choice. You go now into the white man's world, he said in Comanche, with Ayana translating. For Daniel, you will face those who see you as curiosities, as pets, as proof of their superiority. You will face others who see you as threats, as spies, as enemies to be watched. But you will also have the chance to show them something they have never seen: Comanche women, who are neither conquered nor conquering, who bring strength without aggression, wisdom without arrogance. He turned to Daniel. And you, Bridgeman, will discover whether the completeness these women see in you is real or illusion. The test will not be the work you do with your hands, but the example you set with your character. What if I'm not as complete as they believe? Then you will learn to become so. Completeness is not given, Crawford. It is earned through choosing to serve something larger than fear. The ceremony that followed was unlike anything Daniel had ever experienced. Each woman spoke briefly about what the journey to Fort Belknap meant to her, what she hoped to contribute, what she feared, what she anticipated. Their words, translated by Ayana, painted a picture of remarkable courage: young women choosing to step into an uncertain future because they believed in the possibility of something better. When it came Daniel's turn to speak, he found himself struggling for words that could match the significance of the moment. A month ago, he began, I thought I knew what my life was: quiet, safe, predictable. I thought I had everything figured out: how to live alone, how to work around my limitations, how to avoid the complications that come with caring about other people. He looked around the circle of faces illuminated by firelight. You've shown me that what I thought was completeness was really just elaborate avoidance. You've taught me that my hand, he raised his right hand, is exactly what I need to do the work I meant to do. Not because it's sufficient despite being single, but because it's perfect for the purpose it serves. Tomorrow we leave this place and begin something unprecedented. I don't know if we'll succeed. I don't know if the world is ready for what we're offering. But I know that hiding from the attempt is no longer an option. Chief Nokoni nodded solemnly. Spoken like a man who has found his purpose. Late that night, as the others slept, Daniel sat alone on his porch listening to the rain. Tomorrow would begin the most challenging chapter of his life, but for the first time since childhood, he felt truly ready for whatever came next. The storm was passing, and through breaks in the clouds, stars appeared, the same stars that had watched over his years of solitude, now witnessing his emergence into a larger world where completeness would be measured not by what he possessed, but by what he was willing to give. 6 months after leaving his homestead, Daniel Crawford stood in the doorway of the largest workshop he'd ever commanded, watching the morning sun stream through windows designed to capture every available ray of light. The space buzzed with activity that would have been unimaginable during his years of solitude: apprentices learning his modified techniques, Comanche women teaching traditional crafts to army wives, soldiers and civilians working side by side on projects that served the entire community. At the central workbench, Ayana guided a young corporal through the process of weaving sinew bindings. her patient instruction transforming what had been seen as primitive technique into sophisticated engineering. Nearby, Nayeli consulted with the fort's physician about medicinal plants, their conversation conducted in a mixture of English and technical Latin that impressed even the educated officers. "Never thought I'd see the day," said Sergeant McKinnon, pausing beside Daniel with an armload of lumber. The grizzled veteran had been skeptical when Daniel first arrived, but 6 months of witnessing unprecedented cooperation had changed his perspective. Indian women teaching white soldiers, white craftsmen learning tribal techniques. The world's gone topsy-turvy, and somehow it's working better than before. Daniel smiled, running his hand along a table he'd recently completed, his most ambitious project yet, incorporating both his precision joinery and traditional Comanche decorative elements taught by Xochitl. The result was something entirely new, beautiful in ways that neither culture could have achieved alone. Different isn't always worse, Sergeant. Sometimes it's exactly what was needed. The success at Fort Belknap had exceeded everyone's expectations, including Daniel's own. Within 3 months, the productivity of his workshop had doubled, not because he was working harder, but because he was no longer working alone. The Comanche women brought skills and perspectives that complemented his own, creating solutions to problems that had frustrated the Army for years. Malinali had revolutionized the fort's medical practices, introducing herbal treatments that proved more effective than many conventional remedies. Itzel's knowledge of local weather patterns had improved the timing of supply expeditions. Istus, the youngest, had shown remarkable aptitude for mechanical innovation, adapting Daniel's one-handed techniques to create tools that helped other disabled veterans, but perhaps most importantly, their presence had begun changing attitudes. Soldiers who had once seen all Indians as enemies now worked daily alongside Comanche women, learning that competence and character transcended racial boundaries. Officers' wives who had arrived at the fort expecting to find savage threats instead discovered teachers who could show them how to thrive in harsh frontier conditions. The transformation hadn't been without challenges. During the 2nd month, a group of visiting politicians from Austin had arrived expecting to find evidence that the integration experiment was failing. Instead, they discovered a workshop producing the finest furniture in Texas, a medical facility with better patient outcomes than most city hospitals, and a community where cooperation had become the norm rather than the exception. "Mr. Crawford," called Lieutenant Hayes from across the workshop, "Colonel Morrison requests your presence in his office. He has visitors." Daniel wiped his hands on his leather apron and made his way across the compound. Fort Belknap had grown considerably since his arrival, with new buildings reflecting the expanded mission Morrison had carved out. What had once been primarily a military outpost was becoming something more complex, a model community where different cultures found ways to enhance rather than threaten each other. In Morrison's office, Daniel found the colonel standing behind his desk with 3 men he didn't recognize. Their clothes marked them as Eastern politicians, and their expression suggested they weren't entirely pleased with what they'd observed. "Daniel," Morrison said, "I'd like you to meet Congressman Reynolds from Washington, along with his associates from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. They're here to evaluate our programs." Congressman Reynolds was a thin man with calculating eyes and the bearing of someone accustomed to wielding power. He studied Daniel with obvious curiosity, his gaze lingering on the beaded shirt that had become Daniel's standard workshop attire. "Mr. Crawford," Reynolds said, "we've heard remarkable claims about what you've accomplished here. Some find them difficult to believe." "What specifically do you find difficult to believe, Congressman?" "That a person of your particular limitations could become the centerpiece of such an extensive operation. That Indian women could contribute meaningfully to civilized endeavors. That this arrangement serves any purpose beyond satisfying misguided humanitarian impulses." Daniel felt the familiar heat of anger rising, but months of working with the Comanche women had taught him the power of patience. They had faced far worse skepticism and overcome it through demonstration rather than argument. "Perhaps you'd like to see what we've actually accomplished," Daniel suggested. "Judge for yourself whether our work meets your standards." The tour that followed became a masterclass in quiet dignity, overcoming prejudice. In the workshop, Reynolds and his associates watched Istas demonstrate a modified lathe she designed to help a one-armed veteran return to woodworking. They observed Shokidal teaching intricate beadwork to the daughter of a visiting senator, creating bonds that crossed cultural boundaries down at the medical facility. Malinali showed them infection rates that had dropped dramatically since traditional healing practices had been integrated with conventional treatment. In the Language Instruction Center, Nayeli conducted a class where soldiers learned Comanche phrases that had proven essential for peaceful contact with other tribal groups. It was in Daniel's personal workshop that the real revelation occurred. Reynolds had been examining a dining set Daniel was crafting for the governor's mansion in Austin, work that had been commissioned specifically because of Fort Belknap's growing reputation for excellence. "These joints," Reynolds said, running his finger along a connection so seamless it seemed like the wood had grown that way. "How is this level of precision possible with your limitations?" Daniel picked up one of his modified clamps, demonstrating how it could hold multiple pieces at exact angles while leaving his hand free to work. "Limitations force innovation, Congressman. When you can't do something the way everyone else does, you have to find a better way. And these Indian women, they contribute to this process." Ayana stepped forward, holding a piece of inlay work that transformed the functional into the artistic. "We contribute different knowledge, different skills. Together, we create things none of us could make alone." Reynolds examined the inlay, its intricate pattern telling a story that only someone fluent in both cultures could fully appreciate. "This is quite remarkable. But surely this level of cooperation is unusual, requiring exceptional individuals on both sides?" "No, sir," Daniel replied. "It requires people willing to see past their assumptions. The women I work with aren't exceptional because they're Comanche. They're exceptional because they're skilled, intelligent, and committed to excellence. Just like any good craftspeople. And you don't see your CONDITION as a disadvantage in this work." For the first time, Daniel smiled. "Congressman, 6 months ago I thought I was incomplete because I had one hand. These women taught me I was already complete. I just needed to discover what that completeness was meant to accomplish." The political delegation spent 3 days at Fort Belknap, their skepticism gradually giving way to grudging admiration. On their final evening, Reynolds requested a private conversation with Daniel. "Mr. Crawford," he said, settling into a chair in Daniel's quarters, "I came here expecting to find a well-intentioned failure. Instead, I've discovered something that challenges everything I thought I knew about the possibilities for Indian integration." "Integration isn't the right word," Daniel corrected gently. "Integration suggests one group being absorbed into another. What we have here is collaboration, different groups maintaining their identities while working toward common goals." "Yes, I'm beginning to understand the distinction. And I'm beginning to understand why the War Department is so interested in expanding this model to other regions." Daniel felt a familiar tightness in his chest. "Expanding it?" "There are discussions about establishing similar programs at other forts across the frontier. The success here has attracted attention at the highest levels of government. Congressman, with respect, what we've built here can't simply be replicated. It grew from specific relationships, specific trust built over time. Which is why you and your colleagues would be essential to any expansion. Your expertise, their cultural knowledge, the proven methods you've developed together." Daniel stared out the window at the Comanche camp that had become a permanent part of Fort Belknap's landscape. 11 women who had risked everything on the belief that he could become something more than his limitations suggested. The idea of leaving them, of trying to recreate this delicate balance in other places with other people, felt like betraying everything they had built. "I'll need to discuss this with the others," Daniel said finally. "Of course. But Mr. Crawford, consider the implications. What you've proven here could change the course of Indian policy across the nation. Instead of forced removal or endless warfare, you've demonstrated a third option: cooperation that benefits everyone involved." That night, Daniel gathered with the 11 women around the fire outside their shared quarters. The conversation that followed would determine not just their own futures, but potentially the futures of countless others facing similar challenges. "They want to replicate what we've built," Daniel explained. "Send us to other forts, other regions, to establish similar programs. And leave this behind?" Istas asked, gesturing toward the workshops, the community they'd helped create. "This will continue," Ayana said thoughtfully. "It has become strong enough to survive without us. The question is whether we have an obligation to help others find the same path, or whether attempting to force this model onto different situations would destroy what makes it work." Nayeli countered. The debate continued late into the night, touching on questions of duty, identity, and the price of becoming symbols rather than simply people. But gradually, a consensus emerged. "We came together because of Daniel's willingness to help someone in need," Malinali said. "How can we now refuse to help others who face the same challenges we once faced?" "But we do it our way," Xochitl added. "Firmly, not as government agents implementing policy, but as people sharing what we've learned about building bridges." Daniel looked around the circle of faces illuminated by firelight, seeing the same courage that had first brought them together, now tempered by experience and strengthened by success. "Then we continue forward," he said. "Together." 2 years later, Daniel Crawford stood before a joint session of Congress, his right hand steady as he gestured toward charts showing the success of cooperative programs at 17 military installations across the frontier. Beside him sat Ayana, now officially recognized as Director of Cultural Relations for the Western Territories, her voice carrying equal weight with his, as they testified about the practical realities of building peace through understanding. Boy born without a left hand had become a man whose single hand had helped build bridges across one of the deepest divides in American society. But more importantly, he had learned that completeness was never about having everything others expected. It was about discovering what you alone could contribute to the world. In the gallery, 10 remarkable women watched their former teacher explain to the nation's leaders what they had always known, that strength comes not from uniformity, but from learning to see the wisdom in difference, the power in adaptation, and the beauty in becoming exactly who you were always meant to be. Questions that had once defined Daniel Crawford. What was wrong with him? What was he missing? How could he ever be whole? Had been answered not by gaining what he lacked, but by discovering the perfect completeness of what he possessed. And in that discovery, he had helped a nation begin to understand that its own completeness lay not in the elimination of difference, but in learning to weave all its varied threads into something stronger and more beautiful than any single strand could ever be. The man born with one hand had taught a country to see with clearer vision, and in doing so, had found his way home to himself. But the story of transformation was far from over. As Daniel and Ayana returned to Texas after their congressional testimony, they found a world that had shifted beneath their feet. News of their success had spread beyond government halls into newspapers, churches, and parlors across the nation. Letters arrived daily from other disabled veterans seeking Daniel's techniques, from tribal leaders requesting consultation, from military commanders asking for guidance on peaceful integration. The small cabin that had once housed Daniel's solitary existence was now the headquarters of what newspapers called the Crawford Method, a systematic approach to building cooperation across cultural and physical differences. But Daniel resisted the grandiose language, preferring to think of it simply as people helping people discover their own completeness. We've become a story people tell themselves, Ayana observed one evening as they reviewed requests for assistance. Some see us as proof that their prejudices are wrong. Others see us as threats to the natural order. Which are we? Daniel asked, setting down a letter from a group of Confederate veterans who wanted to establish a workshop using his one-handed techniques. We are what we have always been, people who found a way forward when the obvious paths were blocked. The growth of their influence brought unexpected challenges. Entrepreneurs appeared claiming to have developed Crawford-style tools for disabled workers, usually inferior copies that missed the essential principles behind Daniel's innovations. Politicians referenced their work to support policies they had never endorsed. Religious leaders claimed their success as evidence for various theological positions they didn't hold. Most disturbing were the imitators, well-meaning but unprepared individuals who attempted to recreate their multicultural workshops without understanding the delicate balance of respect, skill, and genuine need that made cooperation possible. Several of these efforts failed spectacularly, sometimes reinforcing the very prejudices Daniel and the women had worked to overcome. We need to be more selective, Nayeli warned during one of their planning sessions. Not everyone who claims to what our help is ready for what real cooperation requires. How do we tell the difference? Asked Istis, now married to a cavalry officer and serving as cultural liaison for the Southwestern Division. The same way we always have, Malinali replied. We look for people who ask questions before making demands, who listen before speaking, who understand that change requires patience. This wisdom led to the establishment of what became known as the Texas Protocol, a careful process for evaluating requests for assistance. Rather than immediately agreeing to help establish new cooperative programs, Daniel and the women would first spend time observing existing conditions, talking with all parties involved, and honestly assessing whether the foundation for genuine partnership existed. The protocol proved its worth when they were invited to mediate a crisis at Fort Clark, where attempts to employ Apache scouts had resulted in violence and mutual recrimination. Rather than arriving with preconceived solutions, Daniel and 3 of the women spent 2 weeks simply watching and listening. What they discovered was a situation where military commanders had tried to impose cooperation from above without addressing the underlying fears and misconceptions on both sides. Apache men who had been forced into scout roles felt humiliated by their dependence on the army that had recently been their enemy. Soldiers who had lost friends in Apache raids struggled to see their former enemies as allies. This is not our situation, Ayana told Daniel privately. We came together freely, by choice, through genuine need. These people have been forced together by circumstances they resent. Can it be fixed? Perhaps, but not by duplicating what we did. It requires understanding what they need, not what we think they should want. The Fort Clark intervention became a masterclass in adaptive problem-solving. Instead of establishing workshops or formal cooperation programs, Daniel and the women focused on creating small opportunities for positive interaction. They organized horse training sessions where Apache expertise with difficult animals could be demonstrated and appreciated. They established informal medical exchanges where Apache knowledge of desert survival could supplement Army medical practices. Most importantly, they refused to rush. Where their own partnership had developed over months of gradually building trust, they allowed the Fort Clark relationships to develop at their own pace, celebrating small successes rather than demanding dramatic transformations. 6 months later, when an Apache scout unit successfully guided a lost patrol to safety during a desert storm, the commanding officer wrote to Daniel, "I understand now why you insisted we could not simply copy your methods. We had to discover our own path to the same destination." These experiences taught Daniel something profound about the nature of his calling. He had assumed that sharing his story meant teaching others to replicate his specific solutions. But The real gift he could offer was something different: the confidence to believe that solutions existed for every situation, and the patience to discover what those solutions might be. This understanding transformed his approach to the growing requests for assistance. Instead of traveling constantly to establish new programs, he and the women began hosting extended residencies at Fort Belknap, bringing together small groups of people facing similar challenges and helping them develop their own methods for cooperation. The residency program attracted remarkable participants. A one-legged former Confederate colonel learned to adapt Daniel's techniques for his own carpentry work while simultaneously developing unprecedented respect for the Comanche. Women's strategic thinking. A group of freed slaves discovered how traditional African metalworking could be combined with Daniel's precision methods to create tools of extraordinary quality. A deaf military engineer found ways to use visual communication methods adapted from Plains Indian Sign Language. But perhaps the most meaningful residency involved a young woman named Sarah Mitchell, born without her right arm, who had traveled from Pennsylvania after reading newspaper accounts of Daniel's work. Sarah arrived bitter and isolated, convinced that her disability doomed her to dependence and pity. "I thought if I learned your techniques, I could at least be useful," she told Daniel during their first meeting. "I never expected to find this." This was a community where difference was valued rather than merely tolerated, where adaptation was seen as innovation rather than compromise, where completeness was measured by contribution rather than conformity. Over the course of her 3-month residency, Sarah not only mastered one-handed crafting techniques, but discovered talents she had never recognized: an extraordinary ability to design efficient workshops, a gift for teaching others to see possibilities rather than limitations. When Sarah returned to Pennsylvania, she carried with her more than technical skills. She carried the knowledge that her completeness had been waiting all along for her to recognize and claim it. Every person who learns to see themselves as complete helps others make the same discovery, Ayanna observed as they watched Sarah's train disappear into the eastern distance. "We are not just teaching techniques, Daniel. We are teaching people to recognize their own wholeness." By the 3rd year after their congressional testimony, Daniel realized that their work had evolved far beyond what any of them had originally imagined. What had begun as one man's isolated adaptation to disability had become a movement toward recognizing the value inherent in every form of human difference. The workshop at Fort Belknap now hosts visitors from around the world: European military officers studying integration methods, African tribal leaders seeking techniques for peaceful coexistence, Asian diplomats exploring models for cultural cooperation. The correspondence files contained letters in dozens of languages, all asking the same fundamental question: how do people who seem fundamentally different learn to work together? But Daniel's proudest achievement was something most visitors never noticed: the children. Military families stationed at Fort Belknap now included a generation of young people who had grown up watching Comanche women teach alongside white instructors, who had learned traditional tribal crafts alongside conventional academic subjects, who saw cooperation across differences as normal rather than extraordinary. These children played games that incorporated elements from multiple cultures, spoke fragments of several languages, and displayed a casual comfort with diversity that their parents often found remarkable. When 8-year-old Tommy Patterson asked his father why all forts didn't have Comanche teachers, the question revealed how completely the boundaries that had once seemed insurmountable had dissolved for those who knew no other way of living. "This is our real success," Daniel told Ayanna as they watched a group of children playing a game that combined tag with traditional Comanche hunting strategies. Not the political recognition or the newspaper articles, but the fact that these children will grow up assuming cooperation is possible. They will carry this knowledge into a world that desperately needs it, she agreed. Long after we are gone, they will remember that difference and partnership can coexist. as the sun set over Fort Belknap on the 5th anniversary of Daniel's first meeting with Ayanna, he found himself thinking about the journey that had brought him from isolated hermit to recognized leader. But the transformation that mattered most was internal, the discovery that the completeness he had spent 34 years seeking had been present all along, waiting only for the right circumstances to reveal itself. The 11 women who had once seemed like beautiful disruptions to his carefully ordered world had become partners in building something unprecedented. Together, they had proven that wholeness comes not from having everything others expect, but from offering everything you possess in service of something larger than individual limitation. The boy born without a left hand had found his purpose not in spite of his difference, but because of it. And in that discovery, he had helped others understand that every form of human variation contains the seeds of innovation, compassion, and strength that the world needs to heal its ancient divisions. Standing in the doorway of his workshop, watching the last light fade over the community he had helped create, Daniel Crawford knew with absolute certainty that he was exactly who he had always been meant to be: complete, capable, and ready for whatever challenges tomorrow might bring. The challenges came sooner than expected. Word arrived by telegraph that autumn that violence had erupted between settlers and Lakota tribes in the Dakota Territory. The familiar pattern was emerging: misunderstandings escalating into bloodshed, politicians demanding military action, tribal leaders preparing for war. But this time, there was a difference. For the first time in American history, government officials were asking whether peaceful resolution might be possible before resorting to force. "They want us to intervene," Colonel Morrison explained, his weathered face grave as he delivered the message from Washington, not as military advisors, but as mediators. People who have proven that cooperation between whites and Indians is possible. Daniel studied the telegram, its official language, barely concealing the desperation beneath. 3 settlements had been attacked, 17 people killed, hundreds of cattle stolen. Lakota war parties were ranging across territories where they hadn't been seen in years. Army reinforcements were already marching north, but someone in the War Department had suggested that Daniel and his team might be able to prevent a full-scale war. "The Dakota situation is different from anything we've faced," Nayeli warned during their emergency council meeting. "The Lakota are not seeking cooperation, they are fighting for survival. Their sacred lands have been invaded by gold miners, their treaties broken repeatedly. This is not about building bridges. This is about people who have been pushed beyond endurance. Which is exactly why traditional military solutions won't work," Ayanna replied. "Violence will only create more violence. But perhaps there is another way." The debate that followed lasted 3 days. Some of the women argued that intervening in the Dakota crisis would force them to choose sides in a conflict where both parties had legitimate grievances. Others believed that their skills at finding common ground might be exactly what was needed to prevent a catastrophe. "We are not politicians or soldiers," Itzel pointed out. "We are craftspeople, teachers, healers. What can we offer in a situation where men are already reaching for weapons?" "We can offer what we have always offered," Daniel said quietly. "The belief that people are more alike than different, and that solutions exist if we are patient enough to find them." The decision to go to Dakota was made not by vote but by consensus, the kind of gradual agreement that had characterized all their important choices. They would travel north, not as representatives of any government or cause, but as individuals who had learned how to build trust across seemingly impossible divisions. "Because I am not speaking as a representative of my people's government," Daniel replied slowly, allowing time for translation. "I am speaking as someone who has learned that completeness comes not from having everything you want, but from finding ways to work with what exists." He gestured toward his missing hand, toward the Comanche women who had risked their safety to join this mission. "We are all people who have had to learn different ways of being whole. Perhaps that experience has taught us something useful about finding solutions when the obvious paths are blocked. Sitting Bull studied Daniel's face, his dark eyes reading depths of character that casual observers might miss. Around them, the camp had grown quiet, warriors and women and children gathering to witness this unprecedented encounter. "You speak of being incomplete," Sitting Bull said finally. "But you are here, far from your home, risking danger to seek words that might prevent bloodshed. That does not sound like incompleteness. That sounds like a man who has found his purpose." And in that moment, Daniel Crawford understood that the journey that had begun with a wounded girl collapsing in his yard had led him to exactly where he was meant to be, not as someone seeking his own completeness, but as someone helping others discover that wholeness was possible, even in the midst of seemingly impossible circumstances. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.